get started. Others will join us in. We're starting in 1 minute. Mostly because I have another meeting at 8, so I'd want us to not to rush, but just list everything clear and ensure that everything that is required to be communicated will be communicated. Now, so I prepared a small presentation that will just guide us through this 3-part, let's say, session. We'll talk mostly about GraphQL and Vue.js with more focus on how GraphQL can work with Vue.js, because this is a Vue.js group anyway. So let's get started. If you have questions, there will be a Q&A session, and unlike other presentations, we will actually start with questions on this one. So look forward to hearing what your thoughts are, and looking forward to answering most of your questions, if not all. So I hope all of you can see my screen. By the norm, I'll start with the introduction. So my name is Dormnic Odhiambo. I'm a full stack software engineer. I am currently on leave, but I'm still working anyway. So I mostly do consultations of late, but I'm taking a break to just finish up some stuff with school. My core stack is Python, Node with TypeScript, React, and Vue. I'm not that good with JavaScript. That's why I'm actually in school, because I want to be a master at it. So I'm just going to the basic with front-end development. Just trying to understand how the modern web works. I have, I'd say, 7 years of experience. I've worked across several industries, from betting to process optimizations. And I hope the experience I've garnered through may reflect upon someone, or how I get to answer someone's question correctly. So today we actually gathered here to celebrate the marriage between Vue and GraphQL. If you have an objection, you could raise it, but we hope it will be a good union. To kick us off, I'll just start with a few things you need to know about this talk. I'll assume that you have Node and NPM installed on your computer. I'd assume you have basic knowledge of Vue CLI, and basic or just an idea of what GraphQL is. And of course, since Vue.js is a JavaScript framework, you need to know a bit of JavaScript. Yeah. So in this talk, we will be building something similar to dev.io, which is a developer site where people post articles on what they're working on or cool technologies they found out. Yeah. We'll be using a real-time GraphQL database layer called Prisma. So if you don't know what Prisma is, don't worry. I'll answer that. And this is a 3-part talk on GraphQL and Vue. So most of the work will be concentrated on Vue, because this is a Vue group, but I'm open to answering any GraphQL questions or any other questions regarding web development or software development that you may have, but just ask it at the right time. Yeah. If this is about Vue and GraphQL, then I expect the questions to be about Vue and GraphQL. But that I'll provide channels where you could reach me, maybe ask me questions about a developer roadmap or something cool you want to build or need ideas on. Cool. I'm open to that. So, what is GraphQL? Yeah. As for the GraphQL website, GraphQL is a query language for APIs and a runtime fulfilling those queries with your existing data. So GraphQL is just another way of retrieving data from your database and serving it to a web client. The most common thing I could compare GraphQL to is RESTful APIs. So GraphQL is another, just a more robust query language for APIs where you could structure your data fetching logic to match the structure and types of your data as you store it on the database. And also it's sort of, I would call it a language, because it has sort of rules, syntax, and all that. So it makes the whole process of data querying just so cool and well monitored with one objective and one endpoint. Yeah, so up to there, I will now just open the floor for you all to ask questions or give overviews on what you'd really want to know about GraphQL to help me tailor this talk into something that you would benefit from. So I don't know how we are going to do it because I can't actually see people point hands that are raised, but I believe we are civilized enough to speak one at a time. So you could just raise the question and answer it. If you're not on the mic, just mute it so that we don't have background noise. Thank you. Yeah, sure, Philip, you can unmute.
Hello. Hi, everyone. Hello, can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you. Hello.
Yes. So probably I should start with the an introduction of myself, right?
Yeah.
Yep. Yes. So my name is Philip Okumu. I am, I just recently ventured into full-time programming. I've worked in various industries, research, PR and all that. But somehow I've been brought back to my passion, which is programming, and have programmed with Laravel. And I've just recently ventured into Vue JS, about 6 months. Yeah. And I understand about, I know about, REST API. I have not done GraphQL, though I know about it. So what I would want to know from this discussion is, what you say that it's robust. How much robust? What advantage does it have over the normal RESTful APIs?
Okay.
That is actually the major question that I have.
Okay.
Yes.
That's an interesting question. So just allow me to pick some more questions if there are.
Yeah, sure.
And then I will answer you for now, and I hope that by the time we finish the 3-part session, you will understand how actually GraphQL is different from RESTful APIs. Okay?
Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Anyone else? So I take there are no other questions. Okay, sure, let's proceed. So I sort of expected that question from Philip. So I just jotted down a few things about Graph and REST that you could actually just have a quick skim over just to understand how different they are and how similar they could be. Let me just check the chart. Okay, good idea. Actually, if you have questions, you could type them on the chat. Then we'll just pick them as we go. So what's similar about GraphQL and REST is both have the idea of a resource and can specify the IDs for this resource. So the same way on your RESTful API, where you could have a resource endpoint with, let's say, fetch all users, fetch a single user. So the same way you'd fetch a user with an ID of 3, on REST, the way you'd provide the parameter or the route parameter that identifies the ID of the resource that you want to fetch is the same way. It's actually the same technique that GraphQL uses when you're running a query for, let's say, a single user from your GraphQL endpoint. Okay, thank you, Derek, for that question. I'll answer it. So another similar thing between Graph and REST is both can be fetched via an HTTP GET with the GET request with the URL. So the same way you would make a GET request on RESTful API is the same way a GraphQL is the same way you do a GET on GraphQL. Though with Graph, the endpoint is only one. So you have things called queries and mutations that you send to your server and queries the data and sends it. So we will dive into those nitty-gritties of GraphQL. So both Graph and REST can return a JSON object in the data request. And I think this is what most APIs are returning as data. Most APIs return a JSON. If you prefer XML or text or whatever data that you feel your client can consume, but Graph and REST both can return a JSON. They're different in that in REST, the endpoint you call is the identity of that object, while in GraphQL, the identity is separate from how you fetch it. In this example, I'll switch to a quick server that I've done earlier, of which I'll share the code and just show you how different the REST fetch is different from a GraphQL fetch. So just give me a minute and I'll share the screen again. So I hope you can all see my screen.
Yes,
yeah, hopefully. Yeah, okay. So this is with GraphQL, any project you build comes with something called a playground. So this is a playground, more of a client where you can test your GraphQL queries and mutations, send payload to a database and get response on the same. So what's different with the GraphQL is it's one endpoint, and then you have either a query or a mutation to just direct on what data you actually want from your GraphQL server. Yeah. So for example, if I were to get, I was building a blog, so I want to get the feed of all the articles I've created. So in this query, I have the feed where the type is the post. So I'll be returning an array of posts. Yeah. So what I can do here is either I could filter the type of data that I want returned from this endpoint. Or I could just return I could return the full data. So this is different from REST in that with REST, you would have an endpoint, like let's say, then maybe the ID one, and then the resource would change to maybe projects or whatever. So you'll have to, for every resource, you'd have a different URL parameter or a URL all in all, a link all in all. So if I were to fetch, let's say ID, and if it's published, seemingly there's no data from my GraphQL server, but it would return an array of whatever data that is there. Yeah. So another difference is in REST, the shape and size of the resource is determined by the server. In GraphQL, the server declares what resources are available and the client asks for what is needed. So this is the coolest part of GraphQL, in my opinion. With REST, you have to, for example, the Laravel users here, you know that when you want to tailor your response, you'll create maybe a resource and define the fields that you want the client to see, format them in whatever case you want them in from the resource, and then the server sends this to the client. With GraphQL, the client actually determines what data, only asks for what it wants. From, for example, in the query you saw I was writing, I could decide to just return IDs, only IDs of the posts that I've created, or maybe only titles of the posts that I've created for that specific task that I'm doing. Maybe I'm just doing a widget that will list only IDs of the blogs that I have currently on the platform. So GraphQL will come in that it will filter only, let's say, the ID or the specific parameter that I provided. That is what it will show on whatever response that I asked it for. So for me, that really makes it easier, especially if I'm building a project that is heavy on data, and I don't want to keep track of all the endpoints that are provided within the server. So from this one endpoint, I could write different queries and fetch different type of data that I want tailored for the specific page on the client that I want to run. So I'd actually talked about this part. So the questions that are asked and any other questions that you may have regarding GraphQL. Makiu, this was just a brief introduction. I know most of you are interested in the code lab, of which we will have, but I just wanted to get a general idea of where everyone is regarding GraphQL and what it is that you really needed to learn. So going back to the questions that were asked, earlier, for example, Philip asked, what makes GraphQL more robust than REST? And there was another question. Derek asked, when is it a good idea to use GraphQL? What size of project or what data process? Okay, so I'll start with Philip's question. So according to me, or as a frequent user of GraphQL, I think the main advantage of Graph over REST is that it separates the data from the protocol and it allows the API client to fetch only the data that it wants. So this actually reduces the request lifecycle. If you're looking into the performance part of your application. So I think that at the point where I can just get the specific data that I want from the client and filter it the way the client needs it will actually save me more time than getting all data and then filtering through it in order to get what my client needs. Yeah. So the whole idea of GraphQL is to solve the overfetching and underfetching. For example, in REST, let's say you have you have an endpoint that depends on a relationship in the database. Yeah. So if maybe this database is so complex that you can't handle relations directly from your business logic, you'd expect to have maybe 2 calls on your RESTful API to return the data in the format that you want your client to consume it. But with Graph, is actually from the same endpoint, you could tailor exactly what you want fetched and return it exactly as the client wants, because it's actually the client that is fetching the data from your server. Yeah. The only, as much as GraphQL is praised for that, solving the issue of overfetching and underfetching, it also has its disadvantages. Yes. GraphQL, most of the clients, the best part about GraphQL, it has a robust community, and the tools that they built on GraphQL are actually very interesting. So it is true that GraphQL is self-documenting, and you could build extensive API docs if you want. If you want the docs more readable for other users, let's say, for example, product managers or people that are selling. If your product is enterprise-based and you're selling to companies that are integrating developers, you might need to dumb down the documentation further. But for tech level users, I think out of the box, let me just share. Out of the box, I think the documentation is quite clear. For example, here I can see that in my feeds, in my post model, these are the fields that are required. These are the fields that are needed, and ID could be null when you're creating. Publish could be null when you're creating. Title could be null when you're updating, and author has to be present because the user has to create the post. Yeah. When you're creating a user, the same thing happens. If you decide to go further and maybe validate the user input, the documentation is quite clear out of the box. I didn't write anything for this. This was just generated the moment I finished writing my Prisma query. I'll just show you. The moment I finished writing my Prisma query and migrated the data to my database, this documentation was generated, and a further play area where you could test your data was made. Let me just open the editor. So the moment I defined all this, yeah, and defined my schema as well, when it's generated, all this is transformed into that beautiful documentation that you're seeing. This one here, just to guide you on what you need on when publishing a post, and creating a draft, when creating a user, and fetching feeds or posts. Okay, I'll answer Derek's question first, then I'll answer your question, Philip. Let me see if there's an example on this that could explain exactly what Derek was asking. Something is wrong in my mic. So to answer your question, Derek, I don't think there's any bad time to use GraphQL. I think on a developer's perspective, I think there's no wrong time to use GraphQL, since it solves most of the things that with REST you have to pull in libraries or write other things like validators to deal with. I like GraphQL because out of the box, it comes with a strongly typed schema. So things like validation are handled out of the box. Things like let's say type mismatch, data filtering, those are done out of the box and are actually dependent on the client. So what actually you need to do is just ensure your data is structured the way you want it, and then just let graph and whatever real-time database layer you decide to do the work. For example, the application I just showed you is purely just GraphQL and an Express server. There was not much business logic that I wrote. There was no controllers to just fetch data from models or do what. Out of the box, I can just create a schema, define my mutations and queries, and then serve it over HTTP, and that's it. The client can just fetch the data, post data, and run a full application out of the box. So I don't think there is a project too small or a project too big for GraphQL. But on the business side of things, let's say it could be hard to get developers that fully understand GraphQL. So it could be expensive for the organization. So if the project does not make sense to spend that much on using GraphQL, then REST would suffice until maybe the project is big enough to scale, and then maybe use GraphQL to just ease in the overfetching and underfetching problem. And then for offline support, I'm not really sure, but I could check. Yeah, so out of the box, there's no offline support, Philip, but using clients like Apollo or Hasura or myriad of libraries that the community has built, you could get tools that add offline support for GraphQL. So any other question? All right, if there's no question, then
Oh, I have a question.
okay.
I'll start by introducing myself. I'm Arnold Kibira. I'm a software developer, mostly with JavaScript.
Okay.
So yeah, I just recently got into this field.
Okay.
So yeah, as I've been learning, I've been writing REST APIs as I've been writing applications as one big monolithic application with
Yeah.
REST API with all endpoints connected.
Yeah.
And I've been recently been told that you're encouraged to use microservices, separating the endpoints. So I
Yeah.
wanted to ask, since GraphQL is like one endpoint for searching the whole thing, does it have any downsides when it comes to not writing a monolithic application?
Actually, that is now more on the architecture side, but it's a good question. So it reminds me way back, I was working for a company that their core stack was mostly Java and Spring Boot. So they were working with microservices. And then they had a very good front-end developer that suggested GraphQL for their Angular client. So it brought a huge discussion within the organization on how we could integrate Graph to the current ready REST APIs so that we don't have to really dismantle whatever we've built on the backend to support GraphQL for the client. So to answer your question, Arnold, there are ways that you could use GraphQL with microservices. There's a technique called backend for frontend, BFFs. So what BFFs does is it works like an API gateway, but for GraphQL. So you build, maybe if you want your BFF to be Node, you build a Node microservice that feeds on all your microservices and transform them into a GraphQL layer. Or alternatively, for, let's say your application is divided into modules, yeah? There are modules with the complex data types that might need a lot of relationship or query syntaxes to just get data from. So such parts, yes, as much as you could use GraphQL, but if you're moving from your legacy product to GraphQL, then such areas you could leave them still on REST. But for areas that are just fetch and post, you could actually work directly from your database by just adding maybe Prisma on the middle to abstract your database and create models. Then your client will consume data directly from the database and still serve across all these microservices. Did I answer you?
Yes. Thanks. But I think I'll also have to look more into the BFFs you just mentioned.
Yeah, I think it's the best solution for microservices, but maybe there's something new that, since these things come out every day, maybe there's something new that is now being worked on. I personally have worked only once with microservices, and we used the BFF approach. But if there's any I found out before the next presentation, I could let you know. Yeah.
Okay, thanks.
Yeah, so any other question? Oh, learning curve for learning GraphQL. I actually don't think there's a huge learning curve. GraphQL is a language on its own, so there's a lot you need to know about the syntax. Aside from the syntax, you just need to understand the basics of GraphQL. I like that it has a huge support and it's backed by Facebook, so resources are everywhere regarding Graph, and a lot of people actually trying to have whatever software they're working on compatible to GraphQL. So there are resources out there, and we are here for questions or any guidance that you might need during your learning period. But the learning curve, I'd say for someone who's good at comprehension, a month maybe, and so there's a question about GraphQL over gRPC. So with gRPC, I think it depends on, I would say I would use gRPC for process-heavy endpoints. GraphQL over gRPC, now you're making me biased because I'll pick gRPC, but it actually depends on what I'm building. But GraphQL would solve the same thing you're building on gRPC, but I think for you to pick gRPC, it means you're actually building something that requires, I would say, speed or a lot of optimization, something with no time for delays or type mismatches or something like that. Yeah, so since we are getting to time, I just wanted us to clone and maybe set up the server that I built, so that next week when we get started on the Vue work and actual how GraphQL and Vue works and what Prisma is and Vue Apollo is and what Apollo is in general, maybe we should have this setup here ready and running, so that when we get started next week, we just kickstart the whole stuff, the cool stuff that you actually came here for, not the things I've been talking about the entire time. So the repo is actually on the Vue Kenya GitHub. And let me see. Okay, I'll just make it public so you can see. I didn't have time to write tests, but feel free to create a PR and write tests. If you have OCD about not writing tests, you can poke the rep and write tests. Visibility. Okay, so here it is. You could clone. I'll edit the README with more instructions on how to set it up. It's not so much code. It's just a simple server schema and the Prisma. So out of the box, if you have Docker out of the box, this will work perfectly. But without Docker, there's a bit of configurations that you need to do, connect it to your local database. So I'll just add that to the README shortly and share. So for the next session, you could clone this, ensure it works, play along with it. You can add more data, maybe challenge yourself to add auth to it. We'll add auth eventually, but if you could just see where this GraphQL thing is going, gauge yourself before we actually just jump in to get a feel of how it works. That would be nice. And I'm here for questions or answers if there's any. So go to the Vue.js Kenya, clone this, fire up the good old npm, try run it on Docker. Yeah, the link has been shared on the chat. And then next week, we'll get into the serious stuff. So any other questions? Also, these questions that have been asked here will be, I'll add a bit more information on this as we progress, because at least now I know what it is you're looking for in GraphQL and why you'd want to move to GraphQL. So I will tailor this talk to actually match your needs. I will also avail a Medium article just explaining what we've done. I'll incorporate what I did building this so that it doesn't look like it's just magic. So you could follow that up, or you could just clone it and hack away. Yes, yeah. Anything you want me to cover, any new thing that you encounter as you read about GraphQL in the coming weeks and you'd like me to cover or explain more, just let me know so that we tailor this to your needs, so that also we get to answer the exact question that you want answered. For a starting point, I think you should start from the documentation. I know developers are lazy, but you need to start from documentation. Just try and understand what GraphQL is, why it came to be, and what it's trying to solve. That will help you comprehend why things actually work the way they are on GraphQL. Then from there, you can actually just pick up a tutorial or a course, or you could build whatever we are looking to build here actually covers a lot of core parts of GraphQL. So I'm sure if you build this with me or do it much later in your time, it could save you so much time and make the learning curve a bit smaller. Auth with GraphQL is actually quite simple. Yeah. And the logic is simpler for me because GraphQL handles almost everything. The only time you write code is actually your custom plugin to generate the token. Yeah? And then Philip, Apollo comes in. Apollo is a client for GraphQL. So using GraphQL out of the box is a bit challenging, especially for clients. So Apollo is just a GraphQL client that abstracts all the functionalities that you could have written yourself. Yeah. So the same way we have that playground when you're testing your APIs. So Apollo provides something like that playground, but that interfaces with your client. So it's a shortcut to actually just concentrate on making the calls and the queries and not actually writing where the queries should go. Any other question? Yeah, I'd also done some presentation way back on GraphQL, so I'll share a link with what I did then. So maybe that was more of a GraphQL only as an introduction. So maybe you could go through that as well ahead of next week. I'll try and make it more about Vue next week and stop talking so much about Graph. But Graph will be a little bit in there because it's actually why we are talking about Vue and it. If there are no more questions, I'd ask to go. And I'll share the slides. They are not fully complete, especially with the code lab. And I'll finish up the articles today. I was trying to do some graphics for the articles and I suck at it. So it's a bit delayed, but I'll have the articles up and ready tomorrow and I'll share the links on the group. Also, I noticed there are members here that are not in the group. So maybe if you could share a link to them so they join, because there's a lot that we discussed there that might be helpful to them. Any other thing? Part one will drop, let me say Friday. Say Friday. And if you want to reach me privately, this is tricky. I'll share on my GitHub. My GitHub is I'll share my Discord link there. But for now, if you have a pressing question, go to the README, create an issue. Okay. I know that's a bit too much. Here's my GitHub. Maybe I'll just send it private. I'll share Discord link there as well, so you can reach me at any time. I'd humbly ask to leave and see you all next week, Tuesday. Yeah, next Tuesday, all the code lab will be ready. All the articles will be up, and we'll just go through them as we walk through. Thank you guys so much for attending, and I hope this was informative.
Thank you for joining us, Dom. It was a great session.
Okay, see you guys next week.
All right.